Hello, my name's Andrew Drummond. This presentation relates to research I did last year at King's College London, looking into the relationship between IELTS scores and vocabulary size. The IELTS test is a fairly high stakes assessment for many students, allowing entrance into university with a particular score. IELTS.org say a score of 7 is probably university ready. Students go directly into universities with these scores, or sometimes they get onto foundation programs or pre-sessional programs where streaming is done by IELTS score, as if it's an accurate proxy for language knowledge. But how effective really is the IELTS score when it comes to predicting vocabulary size? How much vocabulary do students know at IELTS 5.5 overall? Is there a reliable mean? What about 6? What about 7 up to 8.5? Foundation programs and pre-sessional programs often give out authentic texts, even quite difficult research articles, as if students are able to read them. But how much vocabulary do these students know at different IELTS points? How likely is it that they can actually read these texts? If you are streaming students by an IELTS score, and you stream by 6 or 6.5, are you likely to have students in that class who have similar language knowledge when it comes to their vocabulary skills? These are the questions that this study kind of looks into. Almost all the sort of theoretical work here comes from Paul Nation's work. This is one of his studies from 2006, in which he calculated how much coverage of a text you get every time you know or acquire 1,000 word families in English. He calculated that the target receptive vocabulary size you need is between 8,000 and 9,000 word families if you want to be able to read 98% of a text written for an educated native speaker. That's how much coverage you get. How many times are you going to encounter a word you don't know? If you know between 8,000 and 9,000 words, well, approximately 1 in 50 content words will be unknown to you if you know that. And certain studies have shown that this 98% threshold is when students can read a text without significant burden being put upon them. You can see the figures on the left relate to exactly how much coverage of a text the first 1,000 word families give you, the second 1,000 word families, the third. These are organised in terms of frequency. The first 1,000 will be very familiar words like the, of, and, at, but, and third, fourth, fifth, you're already getting into some quite rare words, and the further down you go, the less frequently you'll see these words, the less they contribute to creating an overall amount of text coverage you're likely to have from your receptive vocabulary knowledge. So how do you know how many students a word knows? I mean, you can't go into the mind and count them. You can't ask the student to write them all down on paper. So obviously you use an instrument, a testing instrument. There's all kinds of discussion about what's the right way to do it. Nation and Belgar's way is to sample from each of the 1,000 word levels of frequency. So you sample from the most frequent 1,000 words in the language, and the second and the third. You devise a test where you have 10 test items from the first level, 10 from the second level, 10 from the third level, and you say, well, approximately 90% or 80% of words in that level based on that small sample. So that means when you get your test score, say for example, if you get 80 out of 140 items, they might say, well, approximately, 8,000 word families. It is always thought to be approximate because, well, for many reasons, actual receptive knowledge might go up and down on a particular day depending on your mental state, your energy levels, as well as the particular sample in the test being unrepresentative for some reason, of your overall vocabulary knowledge. It's only 10 words. It could be not the words you know just by chance, really. Anyway, it's the most principled, some people would say the most principled attempt so far to measure. The questions look like this. You get a multiple choice question, the word period, for example. It was a difficult period. There it is in the exemplar sentence. And then 4 choices: period, a question, time, thing to do or book. And if you know the word, it's hoped that time is the option you choose. The options, the 4 options, are all supposed to be more frequent words than the tested item. However, it does still imply that you know those words as well. So it's sort of testing the word it's meant to be testing and the words that constitute the 4 answers. And that's a bit of a problem with any multiple choice test. And also guessing is a problem. And a researcher named Zhang suggested, or rather showed, that if students have an I don't know option in a multiple choice test, they're less likely to guess. And he also showed that if you penalise for wrong answers, then guessing is reduced. In this test, the test administered by myself, the I don't know option is included as an attempt to reduce the impact of guessing, and also points are not deducted for wrong answers. That's to give credit for partial knowledge of language, which may be closer to what happens when students actually read, where a word partially known in a context might be decodable for them, might not be a stumbling block. That's certainly how we've done it here. And also, of the 140 questions in the test, only 100 were made mandatory. They have to answer the first 100. The last 40 were optional. We didn't want students to get bogged down in the idea that you've got to slog through 40 more of these, even though I don't know these more difficult questions. So they could be skipped. This is some basic information on the sample. These students are all attending a King's College London Foundation programme, 2017-2018. The whole cohort was asked to do the vocabulary test in class. Teachers gave class time for it, and students accessed the test on a Google Forms form of the quiz, which corresponded to Nation and Burgar's original Test A, the 14,000 word version. 205 valid responses were received. That's not the whole sample. It's approximately 2/3 of the whole cohort, because some of the students indicated they didn't want their scores to be included. Some of the students gave more than one IELTS score, so we weren't sure what to do with that. Some had technical problems. The Wi-Fi in King's that day wasn't very good, which worried me a bit in terms of the results. You don't want students to get frustrated and potentially guess or skip unnecessarily. In the sample, there were a number of first languages represented. Mandarin speakers were the largest sort of sub-sample. Arabic speakers often were bilingual. There were 26 Turkish speakers. It's probably worth saying that the foundation programme is very expensive at King's, and living in London is expensive. So although it's surely hard working, many of the families that these students come from represent fairly well-off families in some ways. So that should be considered in terms of assessing how generalisable these results are, because most of these students would have had access, if not to private education, then tuition and so on. Most of them didn't just go through getting the bare bones of however excellent state education was on offer. They would have had often as much help as they possibly wanted. So they'd be at reasonably strong levels of English, perhaps relative to some of their counterparts who didn't have those advantages. So test results are gotten on the Google Forms. It tells you, creates a spreadsheet and says this student got 80%, this student got 80 right, and you can have a look at it and say, okay, they got 7 correct in the first 1K level, the first 1,000 word sample, they got 6 right in the second, and so on. You can look at all that. And you can also put the data into statistical analysis. So yeah, a stats package was used to analyze the results to generate Pearson correlations. This is basically a number which shows the strength of the relationship between two variables. The first variable is the IELTS score, the overall IELTS score, or the reading plus writing IELTS score, or the individual scores were tested. This was to try and find out if you're streaming, which of these scores, if you only had knowledge of IELTS score, which one would you use to stream a class? And it turns out that not reading and writing combined, but the overall IELTS score will give you the best indication of vocabulary knowledge at each point in the IELTS scale. Even so, 6.78 correlation is moderately strong. It's not, I mean, if you were just going to stream on this, you'd want something quite a bit stronger than that, as you'll see when you look at the individual data points. Reading, which is often thought to be a strong correlator with receptive vocabulary knowledge, doesn't come out so well here. If you look on the far right, it's on the right hand side. There could be many reasons for this. High stakes tests, which are formulaic, you can practice them dozens of times. You can practice the multiple choice format. You get an idea of what the test takers want, and that could potentially compensate even when your vocabulary knowledge is lower. Conversely, the speaking score is the highest individual speaking score. That might represent that our students, as I said, they've got a lot of advantages in life, many of them, and possibly felt that they were going to go to the foundation program anyway, so IELTS test wasn't really that important for them. They're in the middle of their sort of high school experience in their home countries. They still do reasonably well on the speaking because they're very fluent, but the more cognitively challenging parts of the test, like reading and writing, maybe they didn't feel that they ought to or they needed to put themselves fully into that. I'm trying to explain this because, although I don't know if that's the case, because reading is normally a stronger correlation than that, and speaking is often a weaker correlation. Productive skill, right? Why would that correlate more strongly with receptive written knowledge? That's my best guess, really, but truthfully, we don't really know. If you organise the whole of the 205 responses according to IELTS reading score, in the hope of getting distinct levels of language ability, you get a reasonable result out of that. You can see on the graph on the left, the mean scores more or less go up at each point of the IELTS scale, beginning with IELTS 5.5, then 6, 6.5. There's a bit of up and down though, and the mean increases aren't that large. Also, the standard deviation scores on the right have highlighted 3 that are above 20, which is a reasonably large. So if you take the mean score, let's look at IELTS 7.5. You say the mean score is 90, standard deviation 22.5. That means to get the middle, like 67% of that range of scores, you'd need to go 22 points lower. Sorry, 22.5 points lower and 22.5 points higher. The middle 67% of that IELTS 7.5 score is kind of going now from like high 60s to 112. So it's, say, between sort of even 70 and 110. That's quite a wide range of scores if you're looking for sort of a homogeneous sample from an IELTS score. So reading's not really doing it. Check the similar table on the next slide. The standard deviation scores are much smaller. There's only 1 over 20. The graph on the left, the means all increase now. Every point on the scale increases, and the mean increases are higher. This is the organisation based on IELTS overall score, which shows that for streaming purposes, IELTS overall score for this sample and potentially this type of sample is a better predictor of vocabulary size. This is a graph of the correlation. So looking at the graph on the left, you've got the IELTS overall score correlated with the vocabulary size test score going up the horizontal axis. And you can see that the mean increases, represented by the line, increase as you go up the IELTS points. There's still a wide range of scores at each point though, but they're not as wide as the organisation on the right, which is for the reading score, where the scores are much more scattered. You don't get those dense collection of scores in the middle like you do in many of the points in the chart on the left. We're going to look in more detail at one of these points on the scale. We're going to look at IELTS 6.5 dispersion of scores, which, as you can see, is reasonably wide, and we'll see exactly how wide on the next slide. So these are all the scores from the overall IELTS 6.5 band. These are the vocabulary size test scores, again approximately corresponding to an overall vocabulary knowledge 100 times greater than that score. So 80 in this box may represent around about 8,000 word families. Don't forget, that's the number you want if you're going to understand 98% of a text written for educated native speakers. And you haven't got a lot of students at that level. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 of those. Everybody else is below 80. Okay, 75, 76, 77, you're probably okay, but you've got a lot of students lower than that, and also a wide range. So if you took 15 of these at random, would you have a very homogeneous group? Probably not. You know, you'd have students down in the 40s, up into the 80s and 90s. So you're going to give them all the same text, you're going to give them all the same vocabulary, collocation practice. They probably need very different lessons. The mean score in there is 69, by the way, so considerably lower than the 88,000 sort of level. This is another way of looking at the data. Earlier on in the presentation, we saw Paul Nation's data on how much text coverage you get for each 1,000 word family. Based on frequency, the first 1,000 words gives you more text coverage than the later. There was that diminishing returns thing. That model could be added to give an overall text coverage for the mean student or the average student at each point on the IELTS scale, the overall IELTS score. So for IELTS 5.5, you could say, well, if you aggregate all of the test scores, the vocabulary size test scores for all of the IELTS 5.5 students, so on average they get 80% of the 1,000 word family is correct, and 70% of the 2,000, 60% of the next 1,000 word level, and then you say, okay, so for the first 1K level they're getting 65% text coverage, and then another 7%. You basically add it up based on Nation's model to give a rough idea, unvalidated it should be said, for how many unknown words a student is likely or reasonably likely, or the closest estimate we've got for the mean student at each point on the IELTS scale. So for the mean student, the IELTS 5.5 overall, according to this data in this sample, would meet 1 in 10 unknown words in a text written for educated native speakers. That's about 1 word a line. If we take out the function words that are probably known, it's just over 1 word in just over a line. It's actually even worse for the IELTS 6 because of, not really sure why, but they had a lot of errors in the early part of the test, which was more heavily weighted. So they've got 1 in 8 unknown words, although more samples might change that. A wider range of students, that might change a bit. Otherwise, they go up in that the higher you go on the IELTS band, the less frequently you meet unknown words in a text. Until you get to IELTS 7.5, where 1 in 23 words are unknown. You can get through a few lines of text without finding something you don't know. IELTS 8, 1 in 26, it's really only IELTS 8.5 overall. It's students rarely have that, as I'm sure you know if you've come this far into the presentation. 1 in 62 unknown words, and they've got that threshold there, the 98%, which was the threshold recommended by Nation, and nobody else has. So in practice, students probably get used to getting around this and decoding words their own way, or making probably accurate judgments about what they can ignore and what. But even so, everything up to IELTS 7.5, it looks quite heavyweight burden of unknown lexis to me. 1 in 14 for IELTS 7. We're going to have another look at IELTS 6.5 in a slightly different way. So they, according to this unvalidated model, would find 1 in 11 content words unknown in a text. So if you remove 1 in 11 content words from this text, you get this. And if you try and read it, actually, admittedly, it was a difficult text anyway, but if you try and read it, it's difficult because those missing words are contributing a lot of meaning to the text. And when teachers say things like, oh, they need to develop guessing skills and things like that, okay, fair enough, and actually students do well when they do that, but let's not underplay the difficulty of unknown language in a text. It's not enough to do one lesson about, with 3 multiple choice options and an unknown word and expect them to be able to plough through heavyweight academic text. That's unrealistic, and it's disadvantaging students who could have done well if we'd structured our programs differently. And that brings me on to those students. I mean, let's say for argument's sake, 25% of a cohort of foundation students, level 3 students, that they don't need to be given undergraduate texts yet. So you give them a research article, which is an undergraduate text. It's not a level 3 text. Can't we do something to make their lives a bit easier, given the amount of unknown language there? Why not offer 2 versions of a text, an original and a simplified version, a scaffolded version, done in a principled way? You could shorten it. You could write headings for every paragraph. Imagine a text about Thatcher that reads, Thatcher comes to power, challenges union power, civil unrest. At least those headings would give an idea of what's in the paragraphs, and then the language itself could be simplified in a principled way. You can use Lawrence Anthony's and word profiler software for this. It will highlight every word over a certain level. You say, okay, the first 4,000 words, 4,000 word families we'll keep in. Everything after that we're going to look at to see if a synonym, not one of the essential subject-specific words, not a key terminology word that you need, but just a difficult word, a rare word that's been thrown in by the writer, which is not required for a level 3 student who is still developing their language skills. Let's take out some of those. What if we take out 25 on a page? 20. At least you're going to increase epistemic access to knowledge in that text considerably for students who might have given up, who might have had their self-efficacy challenged and, the icy winds of failure blowing around their mind on the basis of being challenged and defeated by this language all the time. If we can change that, and if that doesn't need to be that way, then perhaps we should. The same thing can be done on LexTutor, Tom Cobb's excellent website. Have a look at the text. It will colour code all the language for you. There's loads of tutorials about doing this on YouTube. And then take away again, like the more difficult words, not the subject specific ones, but the ones that are just getting in the way, really. Okay, this is a bit of statistics. It should be said that this Anova test, assessing if there's a statistically significant difference between the vocabulary size test scores at different IELTS levels. Using a post hoc test, you can have a look to see if the different groups in the Anova test, where there's a statistically significant difference and where there isn't. So think of it like this. Actually, for all the assumptions to be met for an Anova test, you need to have a randomised sample. And this sample isn't randomised. I mean, it's not cherry picked, it's not convenient sample, but it is an attempt to sample the whole cohort of students coming to King's for a foundation programme at a certain year, a certain distribution of men and women, males and females, certain distribution of IELTS scores, certain distribution of background, educational background, all those things. Hard to actually define what sort of population that is exactly. Even so, it wasn't randomised, so these scores are given for sort of out of interest really, but treated with a bit of caution. Essentially what you're doing is you're saying, if I look at the vocabulary test scores got by the IELTS 5.5 overall students and the IELTS 6 students, this is the table on the left now, are they sufficiently different so that if you look at them, their means and the dispersion in each group, do they look like different populations? Do they look like there's any meaningful difference in language knowledge between those groups or not? If all the scores are mixed up and there's not really that much difference between them, you get a high p-value. If they're so different that it's unlikely to have just been by chance, you get a low p-value. So a statistically significant p-value is less than 0.05. So looking at the data on the left, essentially what it says is, except the two bands in the middle, 6.5 to 7 and 7 to 7.5, there's no meaningful statistically significant difference in terms of vocabulary test scores represented by these two different groups. It's almost like saying you might call them different, but the data doesn't really support that they have any meaningful difference in their means. Now, in practice, programs don't always stream by the 0.5, but universities do allow or disallow entrance on the 0.5, and vocabulary, which is a constituent of that score in terms of a sub-skill, and also something which will be highly required when you get onto your university course, can vary so much within one of those points that there's no statistically significant difference at most of these levels, and yet we maintain that there is that threshold when it comes to barring or allowing entry. The same test is run on the right with one whole band differences, and as you can see there are more statistically significant differences, results that say these look like different populations, different means, probably not by chance. The 6 to 7, the 6.5 to 7.5, the 7 to 8, they looking like quite different populations. At the lower and the higher end, they don't look quite so different, but they're still lower scores. With caution, what this suggests for this type of sample is that you might want to consider streaming by whole band differences, the 6.5s, the 5.5s, the 7.5s, in different groups, and not trying to make different groups from just 0.5 differences in IELTS overall score. Out of interest, there's a difference in means in the first languages represented in the sample. Arabic speakers have the highest mean, although again some of these students listed themselves as bilingual, so that would definitely increase their receptive vocabulary size. Chinese had the lowest mean score in the sample, and Turkish were a little bit higher. The standard deviation scores treat with caution because Chinese had the bigger sample size, so that will reduce standard deviation over the bigger the sample size gets, basically. Actually, I have got some data on the Chinese part of the sample, and it had a much lower correlation between IELTS score and vocabulary size. It was down to less than 0.3 compared with that 0.67 for the whole sample. So actually the Chinese learners seem to have a weaker relationship between vocabulary size and IELTS score than the rest of the sample or Chinese, Turkish and Arabic students put together. So almost done, but the implications of this, well, here we go. The strongest predictor vocabulary size, receptive vocabulary size, is overall IELTS score and not any of the individual scores. But the dispersion of scores within each 0.5 IELTS band is very wide. Why don't we just use separate diagnostic tests and vocabulary tests for language classes on pre-sessionals and foundation courses? Universities could consider offering vocabulary tests as well as IELTS tests and using a combination of those scores, but they probably won't because there's a big push here anyway to get student numbers up. Okay, so based on this data, a significant proportion of our current our sample from last year, and probably similar samples as long as the demographics remain similar, will struggle to read authentic texts. It might be more generalizable to most students with certain IELTS scores, but certainly for samples very similar to this, it definitely looks like you've got to get to 7.5 before most students won't be having a bad time with authentic texts. Modelling the likely number of unknown words in an authentic text highlights this difficulty. Even mean IELTS 7 students may find 1 in 14 unknown content words in a text, which is quite a lot. So, we're education professionals. We can move students up, we can move students down. We don't have to be bound by IELTS scores. We need to be aware that exam technique can mask poor linguistic knowledge, and conversely, very good language skills might not be fully represented due to being unfamiliar with that test and that kind of thing. We can shorten text, we can simplify them, we can scaffold them, grade the language. Why do we need to inflict authentic texts on IELTS 5.5, IELTS 6 students who are just going to struggle? Are we asking them to fail? Are we allowing them onto courses which we don't ever really expect them to pass? Obviously, many of those students will, but what about the 15 or 20% for argument's sake who aren't going to? Aren't we going to do something about them? And finally, the mean, there's a little bit of data that the mean scores for these language groups could be different, and could be worth investigating that further. So, amazing. Thanks for getting to the end of this. Since you've got this far, feel free to email if you've got any questions. The full paper's coming out, and I'll put the link under the video, or I'll send it to you. Contact me on Twitter as well. And if you're a vocabulary researcher, I'd be very interested to hear from you, or anyone really. Yeah, so thank you very much.